In this brief documentary, we will be discussing the topic of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world. It began after the stock market crash of October 1929 and ended in 1939. The Great Depression was America's longest economic downfall that still leaves an impact on America's economic structure to this day. The Great Depression started in 1929 after the Roaring Twenties came to a close. During the 1920s, many spent their time partying and living in big cities. During this decade, the nation's wealth doubled in size and Wall Street began to flourish. The Great Depression started when the stock market took a downfall in October of 1929, which sent Wall Street into chaos and sent millions of investors into bankruptcy. But before the inevitable collapse of the stock market, low wages, debt, and a struggling agricultural sector helped the Great Depression go underway.
During the Great Depression, millions of Americans suffered a huge amount. Though President Hoover and other leaders had promised that the crisis would run its course, things only began to get worse over the course of 3 years. By 1930, 4 million Americans were looking for work and could not find it anywhere. And by 1931, that number had risen to 6 million.
Meanwhile, the country's industrial production had dropped by half. Breadlines, soup kitchens, and rising numbers of homeless people became more and more common in America's towns and cities. Farmers couldn't afford to harvest their crops and were forced to leave them rotting in the fields, while people elsewhere starved.
America economically suffered even more. As the economic depression deepened in the early 30s, and as farmers had less and less money to spend in town, banks began to fail at alarming rates. In all, 9,000 banks failed during the decade of the 30s. By 1933, depositors saw $140 billion disappear through bank failures.
After Hoover failed to aid the country, people voted for a new president in hopes for any sort of positive change. As a result, people voted for Benjamin Franklin because he had promised that government spending would end the Great Depression for good. And unlike Hoover, the deal worked. In 1934, the economy grew 10.8% and unemployment started to decline.
The stock market after this crisis was almost unchangeable. The stock market lost 90% of its value between 1929 and 1932. It didn't recover for 25 years. That's because people lost all confidence in Wall Street markets. As a result, businesses, banks, and individual investors were wiped out.
Soon after the Great Depression was said to be over, World War II began and put even more of a strain on the country. In conclusion, the Great Depression was the most difficult decade economically in American history. When the stock market took a downfall in October of 1929, millions of Americans then soon began to see the consequences that followed Black Thursday. By 1930, 4 million Americans were looking for work and could not find it anywhere, and by 1931, that number had risen to 6 million. Due to the severe economic downfall, when the elections of 1965 took place, citizens all over the country were striving for change, which was only obtained by electing a new president in hopes for a more positive economic change. And finally, once the Great Depression seemed to start subsiding, World War II began, which led the country into an even more economic downfall.